the first female Impressionist. Can you imagine how hard it was in the middle of the 19th century to be the bearer of such an impossible combination? We've already seen how incredibly hard it was even for male Impressionists to break through, even those from wealthy families. So what can we say about a woman in a time when the world was ruled by men? And now I'll tell you everything. Berthe Morisot was born in 1841, the same year as Renoir. A year after Claude Monet, and 9 years after Edouard Manet, after Claude Monet, and 9 years after Edouard Manet, with whom she would have an extremely complicated relationship and who would become her mentor, her guide in the world of art, and at the same time her personal tormentor, always just out of reach. She was born into an aristocratic family with two older sisters, Eve and Edma. They lived in a suburb of Paris. Passy and the whole Berthe family was passionate about art. So when Berthe was 16, her parents enrolled her and her sister Edma in private drawing classes. Young, unmarried women were strongly encouraged to pursue art and other refinements in those days. A young woman was expected to develop her aesthetic side, to engage in music, drawing, singing, and other light and forgivable activities for young ladies, preparing them for future marriage. However, high society women did not pursue these things professionally. A woman could not receive a complete art education because the curriculum always included drawing the nude, and it was considered absolutely unacceptable for a respectable woman to be in the same room with a naked man. Therefore, only private lessons and fine arts courses were available. But as soon as young female artists got married, their main occupation was supposed to become the family, the husband, and household matters. Painting, playing music, and singing could only remain hobbies shown to guests at gatherings as entertainment. That's why the family encouraged Berthe and her sister to pursue painting. They had in mind the quite expected scenario that all this fun would end after marriage. Their mentors were the neoclassical artist Geoffroy-Alphonse Chocard, a painter of the Dominique Ingres school, and later Joseph Manoir Guichard, whom the sisters found on their own after reaching a certain level of skill. He instantly recognized the sisters' talent and felt obligated to warn the family of possible consequences. Given your daughter's natural talent, my guidance will not turn them into mere salon artists, but into true artists. Do you understand what that could mean? It will be revolutionary, possibly even catastrophic in your bourgeois, elitist environment. Are you sure you won't regret the day you let art into your home, which is a respectable and peaceful dwelling? Do you realize that art can influence the fate of your two daughters? His words will be prophetic in several ways, but only for one sister. Guichard assigned the girls to the Louvre as copyists of paintings, and in this way they honed their skills while also earning money. This alone was unusual. Girls and women from high society were only allowed extremely limited types of work, teaching for example, or being a governess, which were essentially extensions of caring for the family. Physical labor was strictly forbidden, and the ideal was for a woman to avoid work entirely, dedicating herself to family or marriage preparation. The profession of artist remained purely male until the middle of the 19th century. Very few women dared to pursue this craft professionally. The Morrison sisters, both talented, chose this path, one for life, the other until marriage. Edma, the older of the two sisters, according to many contemporaries, possessed greater talent and skill than Berthe. But it was she who would follow the rules and, in 1879 after getting married, would stop this activity, remaining in love with painting for the rest of her life. By 1863, the sisters were already studying under Jean-Baptiste Caro because he was the only one who allowed them to be present during his plein-air sessions outdoors. Such painting was rather experimental at that time. The vast majority of artists painted their works in studios. Even Caro's manner made it hard for him to be recognized in academic circles. But the sisters were eager to master this technique. Both young artists spent the summer of 1863 between Pontoise and Auvers on the Oise River working on landscapes. With the zeal of neophytes, each morning they left early for work, faithfully following Caro's advice. Work with determination and perseverance without dwelling on Papa Caro. Nature itself is the best advisor. Since 64, when Berthe was already 23, the sisters sent their landscapes to the Paris Salon and immediately received approval. I couldn't find any information on how they managed to get in there, considering the seriousness of the competition, but I suspect that artists from aristocratic families had a much easier time. Berthe and Edma would exhibit at every salon, Edma until her marriage, and Berthe until 1873, when she meets the artists from the emerging society of rebellious painters who will soon be mockingly called Impressionists. In 1868, during a copying session at the Louvre, Berthe Morisot meets Edouard Manet, whose scandalous fame had been echoing throughout Paris since 1863 with his outrageous luncheon on the grass and the shocking Olympia. Be sure to watch my video about him so you have the full picture. I won't repeat myself here. Manet was surprised by how diligent and serious both young women were about painting, a seriousness rare for someone who took up painting only temporarily, as was typical for respectable young ladies then. Berthe was a very beautiful woman, and she and Manet started a flirtatious conversation which soon grew into a great but extremely complicated friendship. Manet often used Berthe as a model for his paintings, especially in the famous balcony scene and many portraits, likely more than any other woman. Naturally, this would spark many rumors about their love affair. Morisot was considered a femme fatale who broke Manet's heart, and the numerous portraits were seen as evidence of that. Although it is well known that Berthe always posed in the presence of her mother, yes, it was considered shameful for an unmarried woman to be alone with a man, and even for posing for a portrait, a chaperone was required, which is the role her mother played. Yes, even leaving the house alone was not allowed for an unaccompanied young woman. Manet became a mentor and idol to Morisot, guiding him into both the art world and the artist community. Friendship with Manet gave Berthe access to gatherings of young painters who at that time still called themselves the Intransigents and who would soon form the core of the Impressionists and inspire Morisot with their ideas. They were very dissatisfied with the Academy of Fine Arts' conservatism and narrow-mindedness, as it tried to keep newcomers out of the Paris Salon. And at that time, the Paris Salon was the only place where a young artist could exhibit, gain access to viewers and critics, be noticed, and eventually become famous. Manet and Morisot were from the same circle, and soon their families became friends. At the Morisot house, they held Monday lunches every week, with Manet almost always attending. Morisot admired Manet's works and his personality. She almost revered him, but on his part, his attitude was more condescending. He didn't take women artists seriously, being completely sure that she would soon have to give up this occupation. So why waste time on it then? After meeting Morisot, he writes to Fontaine-Latour, "Mrs. Morisot is delightful, it's just a shame they're not men." But much later, when Morisot has already become a recognized artist, Manet will claim that it's all thanks to him. That's partly true, but only a small part. As you can see, even among extremely progressive men who themselves suffered from the conservatism of society, the attitude toward a woman with a paintbrush in her hand was extremely dismissive. Not only did women have to endure sideways glances for taking painting too seriously, but even their male colleagues allowed themselves to be condescending despite obvious talent. Morisot would later state, "I don't think any man will ever treat a woman as his equal. And that's all I'm asking for, because I know my own worth." Berthe valued Manet's opinion, though she didn't follow it blindly. However, her personal life was much more complicated. She called her situation with Manet impossible, and although she burned all her letters in which Manet was mentioned, we can still assume that there was at least sexual tension between them. Morisot's situation was impossible since man was already married. In 1868, Morisot submits Finistère landscape to the Salon. And this painting has some success, especially considering that the paintings of Renoir, Basile, Pissarro and Manet were rejected. That year, Fontaine-Latour persuaded Morisot to pose for Manet's new painting, The Balcony. The painting will cause a scandal for such absurd reasons that they'll seem ridiculous to you. I discussed this in detail in my video about Manet. Check it out. It should be explained here that Edouard Manet's favorite model, who posed for him for Olympia, Victorina Mirin, endured so many insults from the outraged public that by 1868 she simply refused to continue working with him. Becoming a model for Edouard Mann was a huge risk, especially for a lady from high society. If Olympia was nude, then by Manet's idea everything on the balcony should be proper. And Morisot, enchanted by Manet, his paintings and their friendship, agreed and would carefully come to the artist's studio to pose, accompanied by her mother. A contemporary discussing Manet's painting of Morisot and comparing her to Victorina wrote, "When Manet paints Victorina, he paints her as a beautiful object. When he paints Berthe, he paints her with love and tenderness." It seems that Morisot's impossible situation was mutual. It was during that period that the young rebel artists began gathering at the Café Gerbois on Fridays, where they passionately discussed new painting techniques. They argued and tried to find ways to make their way in a world where any kind of free thinking was forbidden. Morisot occasionally attended these debates, which was unusual, even scandalous. A woman artist in a café of men. But the atmosphere of the café and the ideas circulating among this close-knit group of future Impressionists could not help but influence the painting of Berthe Morisot. And she begins to paint outdoors, in liner, which is a hallmark of the Impressionists. They met Fridays at the café, Mondays at the Morisot house, and Thursdays at Edouard Manet's house. Berthe never had a studio. That would have been improper. She painted in her bedroom or living room, making room for Marc Berthe, rearranging furniture, and maintaining the look of a temporary hobby. Moreover, there were restrictions on the subjects as well. As a woman, she couldn't paint just anything she wanted. Women were mainly expected to portray domestic scenes, still lifes, or landscapes. Berthe Morisot didn't have access to real painting, which at the time meant the highest types of canvases, monumental, historical, or mythological subjects. You won't find almost any portraits of men or depictions of public places in her work today. A woman could only paint in an intimate setting, away from prying eyes. That's why the only man in Berthe Morisot's paintings is her husband, Eugène Manet, the brother of Edouard Manet. But you'll learn about that a little later. Even Impressionist paintings were seen as feminine by critics then. Small formats, landscapes, portraits, not battle scenes. In 1891, critic Theodore Vizeva wrote, "Only a woman has the right to strictly practice the Impressionist system. She alone can limit her efforts to conveying impressions." And amazingly, it turned out that Impressionism, in terms of its subjects, was perfectly suited for a woman artist. This arrangement suited Berthe Morisot, who eagerly began experimenting with format. The easel painting technique, gifted to her by Edouard Manet, won Christmas. Many critics view her as the most dedicated to Impressionism's ideas. Out of all the rebellious artists, Berthe Morisot didn't send anything to the Salon of 1869 because Manet's painting The Balcony, which depicted her, was already exhibited there. She went to see it on the opening day of the exhibition and wrote to her sister Edma, "My first concern was to get to the room with the letter M. There I found Manet, who looked wild. He asked me to go look at the painting because he didn't dare approach it himself. I had never seen a face so expressive." He laughed nervously, insisting at the same time that his painting was worthless and that it was a huge success. Honestly, I find him a charming man and I like him immensely. His paintings, as always, give the impression of something wild or even slightly unripe, but I can't say that I don't like them. On The Balcony, I looked more odd than unattractive. It seems that among the curious, the epithet femme fatale has spread. As you already know, the public tore the painting to shreds simply because they didn't like the color of the balcony. A woman who appears untidy and a strange dog. Another scandal broke out over nothing, and this time Berthe Morisot was at the center of it. "Manet is feeling sad," she wrote later. The public, as always, didn't appreciate his exhibition, but for him, it's always a new reason to be surprised. "He told me I made him happy and that he got an offer to sell the balcony for his sake. I would really like that to be true, but I'm afraid his hopes will be disappointed again." Later, after the exhibition, Manet meets Eva González, the 20-year-old daughter of a famous writer and artist, and is captivated by her beauty. He asks her to be his model and begins painting her portrait, which deeply hurts Berthe Morisot. She writes to her sister in August 1870, "Manet lectures me and always uses Mademoiselle González as an example. Ça pève as a ended." She has self-control, perseverance, and can achieve success while I can't do anything. In this letter, we hear the jealousy of a student and the rivalry that will soon push Morisot toward bolder experiments. She quietly celebrates when Monet or González fail and writes to her sister. At the moment, all his admiration is focused on Mademoiselle González, but her portrait is not progressing. He says it's the 40th session and he had to scrape the head again. He himself is the first to laugh about it. And Berthe Morisot at this time begins to experiment and decides to paint a figure outdoors, not in her improvised studio. Getting involved in testing the most advanced, although still controversial and unrecognized in academic circles, techniques. Painting outdoors was doubly risky for a woman, so she does it together with her sister, whom she depicts in this painting against the background of the Lorient port. And she can't wait to show Manet her new creation, which she does. During another visit of the artist to their home, she recalls, Manet and his wife came to visit us, and we went to the studio. To my surprise and delight, I received the highest praise. It seems everything I've done is better than Eva Gonzalez's work. Manet is too straightforward for there to be any mistake. I'm sure he liked everything very much, but I just remember what Fontaine said. Manet always finds the paintings of those he loves to be good. Morisot is clearly obsessed with Manet, his admirer, follower, jealous model, and talented colleague. Pleased by his praise, she gave him this painting. For the Salon of 1870, Berthe Morisot submits that very view of the port of Lorient. A double portrait of her mother and sister has a telling, and I think sad story that shows the relationship between Morisot and Manet. The portrait wasn't going well for her, so she showed it to Puvis de Chavannes, who criticized Morisot's mother's head. Berthe reworked the portrait, but Puvis refused to evaluate the result again. Upset, she showed Manet the portrait. At first, he spoke positively about it, saying he liked everything except the dress's hem. He took the brush and palette from Morisot and made a few strokes, very quickly fixing the unsuccessful area, Morisot writes. That's when my troubles began. Once he gets carried away, nothing can stop him. He moves from the skirt to the bodice, from the bodice to the head, from the head to the background. He cracks 1,000 jokes, laughs like a madman, hands me the palette, then takes it back again. Finally, by 5 o'clock in the evening, we create the most beautiful caricature one could possibly imagine. We waited for it to be taken away. One way or another, he made me put it on the cart, and I was completely devastated. I just hope this painting isn't accepted. Mom finds this whole story funny, but I find it heartbreaking. As you can see, Manet still didn't take Morisot seriously. In response to her timid request, he confidently interfered in the creative process and changed the painting just for fun, deeply hurting the artist. To Morisot's horror, the painting was accepted into the Salon. She braced for criticism, but it never came. The jury was neither impressed nor critical of her painting, treating her with the same condescension as Manet and other women artists. Morisot's second painting was also unfortunate, as it was hung too high to be judged. Neither of Manet's paintings were recognized, and the Eva Gonzalez portrait was called a disgusting caricature in oils. Soon after the Salon, the Franco-Prussian War started. Napoleon attacked Prussia, but was quickly defeated. The fighting spread to France and soon reached Paris. Berthe Morisot truly cared about her brothers. Manet, along with his family, was forced to leave Paris, and the following year there was no Salon. The war lasted only 1 year, and as a result, a new republic was established in France. After the war, Durand-Ruel returned to Paris. The world's first art dealer meets the young Batignolles artists and buys many of their works, including 22 paintings. Morisot Durand-Ruel, free from prejudice and professional jealousy, in fact places Berthe Morisot on par with the strongest Impressionist painters. This fair assessment strongly supports Berthe and boosts her confidence. As artists, inspired by the new business partnership, at the 1872 Salon only Berthe Morisot, among future Impressionists, submitted a painting. For her, the Salon is still the only way. However, her good and fresh paintings once again go unnoticed and fail to find success. People don't believe a woman can paint as well as men. The professional community is just waiting for Berthe to marry and abandon this frivolous pursuit. No one actually evaluates a female artist's talent. Can you imagine what it's like to be more talented than many, to dare to do things that society finds outrageous, and to keep going? When no one around you takes you seriously, and discouraged by the complete lack of any success, she leaves for Spain. In 1973, none of the Impressionists sent their paintings to the Salon again. Edouard Manet and Berthe Morisot remain at the official Salon alone. Manet exhibits 2 paintings. He has a resounding success with his ironic portrait with a mug of beer. and Morisot sends one pastel to the salon. But Manet's second painting is Rest, for which Morisot posed for him. This painting replaces The Balcony, and Olympia, as the most despised painting of the exhibition, Morisot, depicted sprawled on a sofa with her leg hanging down, is called nothing but horrible by the viewers. Critics and cartoonists who didn't like Berthe's relaxed pose called the painting seasickness, implying that the heroine was obviously unwell. Her slouching, her exposed foot, and her unbuttoned button were criticized as unattractive and unfeminine. However, there were also those who pointed out how lovingly Manet painted Berthe, fueling rumors that he expressed his love through his brush, a love that was completely impossible in real life. George Moore, in his memoirs, agrees that these two had a platonic relationship and that Berthe would have married Manet if he had not already been married. Meanwhile, after the war, France began to feel the crisis, art sales dropped sharply, and young artists rejected by the Salon started experiencing serious financial problems. Among them, the idea arises to organize their own exhibition in order to stand out and establish their own connection with the audience, bypassing the blockade set by the Salon. As you probably already understand, this is leading up to that very first Impressionist exhibition in 1874, although they do not yet call themselves Impressionists. The artists passionately discuss the idea and urge their fellow painters not to submit to the Salon of 1874. Edouard Manet rejects this idea, while Berthe Morisot, whose paintings the Salon always accepts, must decide whether to join a group of unrecognized young artists. To risk losing favor with the Salon or to continue exhibiting at the Salon, where no one notices her? An incredibly difficult choice for a woman of the 19th century. Even just her association with a group of male artists compromised Berthe. But as long as she followed the minimal requirements of propriety and didn't encroach on male subjects and style, much was forgiven. Berthe was safe, just like her art, but safety doesn't bring success. Morisot was known more as a femme fatale who had mysterious ties with the scandalous Manet and who also dabbled in painting. But by 1874, Berthe was already 33 years old. She was still unmarried, professionally engaged in a man's craft, mingling with a bunch of marginal artists and posing for that impossible man, Manet. Not every man would dare, in such circumstances, to make his situation even worse. Edouard Manet turned out to be the only one from the group who remained at the official salon. After his beer-fueled success, he felt confident he was on the right path. He tried to persuade Renoir and Claude Monet, and most of all Berthe Morisot, not to take part in this madness and not to ruin her reputation. Edouard Manet was confident Berthe, who respected his opinion, would listen to him. But the artist had grown strong enough, and the disregard from the salon and the official art scene, as well as from Manet himself, pushed her to take desperate steps. By that era's standards, she was nearly a spinster, and society pressured her to marry, risking her career's end. Now or never. And Berthe Morisot decides to join the community of rebellious artists, and in 1874 she does not submit her paintings to the Salon. She will never again, the only one among all the Impressionists, participate in the official Salon. A total of 165 paintings were exhibited at the Impressionists exhibition, 9 of which were by Berthe Morisot. The exhibition, as you know, was held at photographer Nadar's gallery and drew many visitors, but they mostly came to laugh. The critics attacked the artists with scathing articles, the most popular of which was a review by Louis Leroy. Ironic and biting, it became an advertisement for the event itself. The press and art circles were literally flooded with caricatures. All of Paris laughed at the young artists. Here is an excerpt from one critical article. Le Pelletier Street was unfortunate. After the Opera House fire, a new disaster struck this neighborhood. Durand de Ruel has just opened an exhibition of so-called painting. A peaceful passerby, attracted by the flags decorating the facade, enters, and a terrifying sight meets his frightened eyes. 5 or 6 madmen, including one woman. A group of unfortunate people obsessed with vanity has gathered to display their works. The press was literally going wild, and the mother of Berthe Morisot, alarmed by this criticism, asked her friend Guichard to go and see what was happening there. Her daughter was still unmarried, and now this happened too. And she received the following reply: I have seen Nada's halls, and I want to immediately share with you my sincere impression. When I entered there, dear madam, my heart clenched at the sight of your daughter's works. In this murderous environment, I told myself, you cannot live among madmen with impunity. Manet was right when he resisted her exhibiting. By honestly analyzing the exhibited works, of course you can find magnificent parts here and there, but overall it looks like madness. Guicha recommended that Berthe Morisot decisively put an end to this so-called school of the future. Although popular, the exhibition failed financially, leaving the artists with only a bad reputation. As you already know from the story of Edouard Manet, even such notoriety can become a road to fame. But the path will be long, hard, and full of trials that not everyone can endure. It was even harder for a woman, and after the Impressionist exhibition, the attitude toward Berthe became even more wary. Sisley even had to get into a fight with one of the visitors who spoke insultingly about Berthe Morisot. Berthe's mother? After Guicha's review, she pressured Berthe to end her relationships with the artists, forcing the artist to choose between her reputation and her career. And at one of the regular dinners at the Morisot house, when Edouard Manet was painting a portrait of Berthe with violets, he brought up this topic. Berthe's daughter Julie recalls, that day, Uncle Edouard told Mom that she should marry Dad. Dad was Eugène Manet, Edouard's brother, who had long been in unrequited love with Berthe, a friend of the Morisot family, and a regular guest at their home gatherings. Everyone thought this proposal was the perfect solution. Eugène proposed to Berthe, and she agreed. Right after the wedding, she wrote to her sister, I married a wonderful, honest young man. I think he truly loves me. I spent a long time chasing illusions that didn't make me happy. Now real life is beginning. I think by illusions she meant Edouard Manet. Manet and Morisot's relationship is mysterious, but we can infer its nature from indirect signs. While planning the wedding, Man paints Bouquet of Violets, a commemorative piece. In it, we see the very same violets that Berthe was holding in her hands when Edouard voiced his idea about her marriage. There is also a fan from another painting and a note with the inscription, Mademoiselle Morisot, not yet Madame. Manet painted Berthe's final portrait just before her wedding. Morisot appears distracted, looking away, as if distancing herself from the artist while displaying her ring. On December 22, 1874, Berthe Morisot finally became Berthe Manet, taking the surname she would soon pass on to her daughter. Although she would have no other children, she would continue to sign her paintings with her maiden name for the rest of her life. Berthe was very fortunate in her marriage. Eugène not only allowed her to paint, he fully supported her. With a legal background, he used his expertise to manage Berthe. He organized exhibitions, supervised hanging paintings, carried Berthe's easel, and wrote detailed letters about his wife and the Impressionist exhibitions when she was away from Paris during pregnancy. In fact, Eugene legitimized his wife's questionable occupation by standing behind her with his authority, and no one dared to question the propriety of her activities anymore. And Berthe's mother breathed a sigh of relief, having shifted this burden onto a man's shoulders. The burden was lifted from Berthe's shoulders. Now, supported by her husband and no longer needing money, she could experiment. And soon, we will see that sometimes, in her experiments, she would go much further than her male colleagues. The first Impressionist exhibition's financial failure led to the Society's dissolution and inspired a painting sale. As I mentioned before, post-war France was in a financial crisis, and people weren't buying paintings, especially experimental ones. So the sale seemed like a good idea to the artists, and they decided to involve the wittiest man in Paris, Albert Wolff, in this venture. The artists, joined by Morisot, sent him a catalogue and an invitation. And soon a note by the critic appeared in the Figaro newspaper, but its content did not please the friends. He wrote, "This may not be bad for those speculating on future art, but with a reservation. The Impressionists make the same impression as a cat walking across piano keys, or a monkey that has accidentally gotten hold of a box of paints." But the auction still took place in March of 1975. It included 75 paintings by Renoir, Sisley, and Manet, plus 12 by Morisot. The public was furious. They were so outraged by this new art that a whole crowd came to the sale and booed every time a price was announced, interfering with the purchase of the paintings. Durand Ruel, who came to support the artists, simply couldn't buy anything. In the end, he managed to buy only a few paintings, while the rest was sold for next to nothing. Berthe Morisot's more restrained paintings sold for relatively higher prices, averaging about 250 francs each. Of the prices offered, the highest was 480 and the lowest was 80 francs. Manet's prices range from 165 to 325 francs, while Sisley's range from 50 to 300. Renoir, strangely enough, received the lowest prices. 10 of his paintings didn't even reach 100 francs, and he had to buy some of them back himself. The sale raised 11,491 francs, with Berthe Morisot making the main contribution. That year, Morisot and her husband visited Britain's Isle of Wight, where she experimented with a rapid painting technique for the first time. Quick, short brushstrokes trying to finish the painting in one session. This allowed her to capture life in the moment, a ray of sunlight falling, a breeze moving the curtains. Using the tip of a flat brush for thin lines, the full surface for broad strokes, and adjusting paint with the brush handle. None of her fellow Impressionists worked in such a bold and experimental manner, but financial difficulties continued. In 1976, Eugene writes to Berthe, "All the artists are in despair. The merchants are swamped with goods, and Edouard Manet wants to close his studio. Let's hope that the buyers will come back." It's true, the timing is very unfavorable. That's how he described the chance of organizing another Impressionist exhibition. There simply was no money. Fortunately, some artists were wealthy, including Cabot. In the video about Renoir, I explain how his will overcame conservative resistance. Watch it, it's very interesting. Cabot himself was an artist, though a very timid one, and he spent all his money on acquiring Impressionist paintings. Thanks to him, the third Impressionist exhibition was held in 1977. The exhibition featured over 250 works, with the central hall devoted to Cézanne and Berthe Morisot. So as you can see, Morisot's work not only could compete with the greatest geniuses of that time, it was also placed in the most honored spots. Despite the challenges and biases faced by women artists then, the exhibition was again popular, but public and critics' attitudes did not change as artists had hoped. November 14th, 1978. Morisot gave birth to her only daughter, Julie Manet, who became her favorite model in many of her works from childhood to youth. And she even posed for some of her colleagues, such as Manet and Renoir. Berthe Morisot missed the fourth Impressionist exhibition due to pregnancy, showing how women's careers were often interrupted. However, this was brief for Morisot. At the fourth exhibition, the artist minimized risks by removing Impressionists from the title, naming it the exhibition of the group of independent artists. But of course, this didn't fool anyone. Armand Sylvester, a well-known critic, wrote the following: "You're invited to attend the funeral ceremony and burial of the Impressionists. This sad invitation is sent to you by the independents." No need for fake tears or joy. Stay calm, only the word has died. But although the critics were still just as fierce, the public was more favorable and came to be entertained, so the tickets sold very well. In the end, a few paintings sold. After paying all expenses, 6,000 francs remained and were divided equally among the artists. And each of them received 439 francs. Berthe Morisot didn't need money, putting her in a unique position. She didn't have to struggle for a spoonful of soup like Claude Monet and Renoir, so she easily avoided the temptation to exhibit at the official salon. Unlike her colleagues, she systematically developed her art, her brush became more confident, and her strokes grew longer. In the early 1880s, Morisot's work became more mature. Look, you can see this change in her paintings. In 1880, at the fifth Impressionist exhibition, most of the artists did not participate. Only Pissarro, Degas, and Berthe Morisot stayed from the old group. Therefore, we can call Berthe Morisot one of the most loyal Impressionist artists. She sent 12 works to the fifth exhibition. However, a split was brewing among the Impressionists. Some of them believed they should continue, while others thought the exhibitions made no sense. There was a sense of gloom among the artists. Can you imagine what it was like for a woman in those days to continue something that even men were starting to abandon and turn away from? Soon Berthe was with other women. Among the Impressionists, there was a second woman, Mary Cassatt, one of the trio of queens of Impressionism, alongside Morisot and Marie Braquemond. Morisot's path was already drawing other female artists. A new generation of artists emerged, inspired by the bold Impressionists and eager for pioneer acclaim. The sixth exhibition was in serious doubt due to disagreements among the artists, but it still took place, although with a much smaller group. Except for Sisley, Degas and Morisot, the old masters didn't participate. Degas's difficult personality complicated the situation as he had gathered young supporters and was trying to lead the movement. I should explain how these exhibitions were organized. The artists found a venue, calculated worker and organizing costs, estimated expenses, and split the total equally among all exhibition participants. The more participants there were, the less each person paid. And it seemed like everything was fair. However, some artists, such as Claude Monet and Renoir, were so poor they struggled to pay the membership fee due to their financial situation. Some wealthy artist friends took on the payment and risked themselves. Such wealthy artists, for example, were Pissarro, Degas and Berthe Morisot. Those who supported fellow artists also gained power, as their backing could secure an artist's admission to the exhibition. And while Sisley and Morisot acted out of the best intentions, Degas made full use of his opportunities. Over time, he gathered supporters and began a true struggle for power. This met with resistance intensified by Degas' arrogant character, which pushed away the other artists. Degas is the focus of my next video, so subscribe to catch it. He's a fascinating artist. In short, everyone fell out with each other, and this became proof that the old group of Impressionists no longer existed. The seventh exhibition wouldn't have happened without Durand-Ruel. The artists had already started to organize it, but they just couldn't come to an agreement. Who would be displayed where, who would be allowed in, and so on. Everything was further complicated by the fact that in 1982, another economic crisis emerged. In France, there were many bankruptcies, including Durand-Ruel's friend, Feder Durand-Ruel. He had to give him a loan, and he himself was no longer in a good financial position. However, Adila had already invested so much in this new movement that he could not allow it to stall. So, he organized the seventh exhibition, bringing together both established and new artists. But the old group of Impressionists flatly refused to participate alongside the newcomers. Morisot refused to participate if Manet wasn't there. Manet refused if Renoir wasn't there. Renoir thought they only wanted to use him to fill a gap, and Caillebotte wasn't invited. This caused more discord. But they all owed Durand-Ruel so much that, in the end, they didn't dare refuse. Everyone eventually agreed, and the exhibition was held, still without Impressionists in the title. Nowadays, any artist would dream of calling themselves an Impressionist. But back then, as you can see, even such desperate revolutionaries had to make compromises and sometimes swallow their pride. Durand-Ruel's sponsorship allowed the exhibition to avoid inviting outside artists and piecing together the budget. The seventh exhibition ultimately became the most representative and mature, showcasing concentrated Impressionism. Eugene, wrote Bertie Dior, who knows a thing or two about this, believes that this year's exhibition is the best your group has ever organized. I share the same opinion. The press responded more favorably to this exhibition with several positive reviews. New buyers appeared right away, and several paintings were sold at a good price. Durand-Ruel now priced Sisley's paintings at 2,000 francs, while Berthe and Morisot's works ranged from 500 to 1,200 francs. At that time, Edouard Manet, who had never participated in the Impressionist exhibitions, presented his Bar at the Folies Bergères at the official salon. This was his last major work, after which he was named a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. Even then, when Morisot was respected by her peers, he still didn't believe in her. He said without him there'd be no fiancé. Unfortunately, by that time, Edouard Manet's health had already been undermined. In 1883, he was bedridden with leg paralysis and developed gangrene. He delayed the amputation and used poisonous substances at Dr. Gachet's insistence, a committed homeopath. By the time the amputation was done, it was already too late. Manet's death shocked the artists, especially Berthe Morisot, who lost not only a brother-in-law, but also a teacher, supporter, and perhaps someone she loved hopelessly. Ahead lies the eighth and final Impressionist exhibition. By then, a new generation of young artists was already challenging the Impressionist masters. Besides the group's rivalry, pressure from younger artists also grew. And of course, many people didn't like that. Chita, Morisot, Berthe and Eugene organized the eighth exhibition. In 86, they took the bold step of visiting their artist friends and negotiating with everyone. The situation was complicated by both Degas' group and Pissarro. He insisted Serra and Signac be included in the exhibition. The great post-impressionists, who at that time were unknown to anyone and rejected even by the impressionists themselves. As you can see, the atmosphere was, to put it mildly, extremely tense. The impressionist movement was simply bursting with new people. In fact, the Impressionists became the new official salon, only now the rebels were the bearers of new ideas, even fresher and more groundbreaking than Impressionism. However, when Seurat and Signac joined the exhibition, Claude Monet declined to participate. Renoir and Caillebotte followed him, and soon Sisley did as well. Thus, the core group staged a walkout, making it clear that the movement had completely fallen apart. And now each artist is going their own way. In March 1986, Durand-Ruel assembled 300 paintings from his collection after being invited to organize a major American exhibition. Everything depended on it. Although many artists were skeptical, they did not believe that the American public would be more favorable to them and considered all of this a futile endeavor. However, the 8th exhibition was still held on May 15, 1986, 12 years after the first. Edgar Degas' friends, young artists and friends of Alfred Sisley and Berthe Morisot mainly participated. Of the great Impressionists, only 3 remained, but even they were no longer united by a common idea. The exhibition was just titled the 8th Exhibition of Paintings. Impressionism wasn't mentioned. They even dropped the word independent, not to mention irreconcilable, which is how it all began. The critics began to gossip maliciously, mocking Pissarro, saying that after 30 years of struggle, he would have to start over, but this time in the company of artists young enough to be his sons. At the same time, Durand-Ruel returned to Paris. Rumors spread that he hit the jackpot or got mixed up with shady people, but the truth was more ordinary. The exhibition in the United States drew reserved curiosity, with newspapers noting the artists worked with a certain intention. They disregarded the established rules only because they had outgrown them. And if they rejected minor truths, they did so in order to emphasize the fundamental ones more strongly. 2 weeks after the exhibition opened in the United States on April 10, it was announced that 7 or 8 paintings had already sold. Interest in the exhibition was so high that it was extended for another month. The public flocked to see it, while critics debated the merits of the new painting trend. America approached the exhibition openly, sincerely seeking to understand the prestigious old world art. This inspired Durand-Ruel. Before he went back to France, the American Art Association bought several paintings and arranged for him to return in the fall with a new exhibition. When he returned, he said the United States was the Impressionists' chance, and as you know from my videos, this soon proved true. While Durand-Ruel was away, Claude Monet sold paintings through a rival and exhibited with Renoir at a new gallery. In other words, the paths of the Impressionists finally diverged. But there was also one very important event at the 8th Impressionist exhibition. A young and unknown artist from Holland came to Paris and came to see the famous Impressionists. He was struck by the brightness of the palette and the amazing technique of the Parisian artists. This exhibition became a turning point in his vision and changed his technique and world painting forever. This was Vincent van Gogh. Subscribe so you don't miss the upcoming video about him. The 8th Impressionist exhibition ended the group's unity. The year 1886 can be called a turning point when the old group of artists was still full of strength and passion. Her work matured after 25 years of suffering and rejection by the conservative Paris art world. After 1886, Berthe Morisot exhibited a lot, and in 1892, Theo van Gogh organized her private exhibition, The Highest Risk and the Highest Recognition. The exhibition was a huge success. In 1892, Durand-Ruel brought her paintings to another United States exhibition. And after this tremendous success, she was forever included in the pantheon of world-renowned Impressionists. That year, Berthe Morisot's husband Eugène died, and the next year, her sister Yves passed away. In 1894, Morisot went to Brussels to attend a large group exhibition where she presented 4 paintings. That year, the French government purchased her painting Girl in an Evening Dress, one of the first Impressionist works they acquired. The artist died on March 2, 1895 at the age of 54 from pulmonary failure. A year after her death, her artist friends, among whom were Degas, Renoir, and Manet, organized the first retrospective exhibition of Morisot's works, bringing together 380 of her paintings and paying tribute to her talent. In her works, she remained more faithful to the original concepts of Impressionism than any of her colleagues. Even the strict Seurat could not resist the charm and freshness of her paintings and watercolors, or the sincerity with which she expressed her delicate vision. But Renoir loved her most. Since the late 1980s, he frequently visited her and painted portraits of her and her daughter. He considered Berthe Morisot the only painter after Fragonard to possess a truly feminine artistic talent, and he admired the purity of her gift. For a long time, she was seen as a secondary figure in Impressionism just because she was a woman, even though she embodied Impressionism more than the men. She stayed loyal to his ideas, and with her husband, practically supported the entire community. And considering the difficulties that a woman artist faced at that time, I consider her nothing less than a heroine. Berthe Morisot's role was reconsidered much later, when women's rights and feminism became mainstream. Berthe Morisot set an unprecedented example for her time, which paved the way for all talented female artists of today, including the remarkable Natalia Goncharova and Zinaida Serebriakova. I can't wait to tell you about them. Nowadays, we're no longer surprised by the combination of a woman and an artist. We admire the works of Frida Kahlo, Vera Mukina, Louise Bourgeois, and Kusama. But it was Berthe Morisot, refined, brave, unyielding, and forever young, who started this journey, opened this door, and held it open with her delicate body. She was buried on March 6th in the Manet family crypt at the Passy Cemetery in Paris, next to the man who saved her and the man from whom it was so hard for her to escape. Subscribe to the channel and like this video here. We talk about art in an interesting and, most importantly, honest way. Goodbye, everyone.